Eric Kaufmann is Professor of Politics and the Director of the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham. He's written a number of books, including White Shift and Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And his latest book is entitled Taboo, How Making Race Sacred Produces a Cultural, or has produced a cultural revolution. So Eric Kaufmann, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good to be here, Philip.
Can I ask you, how did you come to write this particular book, and why this title? I know it's got a different title in America. I think it's called The Third Awakening.
Yeah.
And you is that right? And you've
Yeah, no,
got
you're right about that. I mean, the book you're holding and the title you're holding was my title. That's my original title. And the contract I got was first with the British publisher. The American publishers wanted a different title. They wanted something a bit punchier, at least in their view. So that was the thinking behind the title shift. But I mean, they both reflect, both The Third Awakening and Taboo reflect, important themes in the book. I mean, it's one of these books that doesn't necessarily have that one very simple, like somewheres and anywheres, or something that is a very simple through line. There's a number of components that build on each other. So it's not as easy to come up with that singular title.
yeah. So is that your title, The Third Awakening, or did they come up with it?
They came up with The Third Awakening, yeah. So which I and of course this sort of second part, 12-point plan for rolling back progressive extremism, you can see that that's obviously quite punchy, and that's sort of something they come up with. And I sort of, I said, okay, fine. I mean, in a way, I suppose they were trying to highlight that sort of side of the book as well.
Okay, so tell me then, what brought the book about? What's your prime motive in writing it? What's it written for?
Yeah, well, I think if you even go back to my first book, The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America, which comes out of my PhD at the LSE, actually, a big part, so that had several components to it. I mean, one was the decline of the WASP as a sort of phenomenon in the 20th century, the United States, and politically, to some degree, demographically and socially, explaining that. And so a lot of the book was really about early 20th century American liberal progressivism. And so I've had this kind of interest in the cultural left going back to that first book and how it then interacts with questions of nationalism and questions of population shifts. So that was not as strong a theme. It was a theme in White Shift, my most recent book, but it wasn't as powerful. But it's now this book, I mean, in a way, my research, with the exception of the religious book, the research has tended to revolve around three things. One is population shifts, so political demography. The other is questions of nationalism and ethnic majority dynamics. And then the third is this question of the cultural left or liberal left. So how do these three things interact has kind of been a constant in my research really since the first book. And again, that religion book was about political demography, but it was more about religion than it was about questions of the cultural left. But I'm kind of returning to then a theme that I've been researching for some time. And of course, in the context of this thing that Matthew Iglesias calls the Great Awakening, right? So there's paroxysm in our culture since the mid-2010s, which people are trying to explain, and of course, coverage in the media exploded. And there have been a lot of books on. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. So I'm kind of contributing to that literature, but I'm hoping to be original within a increasingly crowded field. So,
Well, does some of this come out of your own personal experience, from what I can see, having read the first bit? I mean, there was a striking opening phrase in one of the early chapters. It said, "I'll never forget the morning that an email from my superiors landed in my inbox, claiming that I had breached policies around respect and harassment, and ordering me to attend a tribunal where my fate would hang in the balance." Is that Is that something which has really prompted your book here? And I mean, what was that about, could I ask? Is
Yeah, um, yeah, it probably did in a certain way because yeah, I think until you experience that phenomenon, it's hard to describe it. Just the psychological impact of, especially as an academic, where you know that if you are outside, it's very hard to get back in, especially in the place you want to live. So there's a lot of fear about job loss and and there's a lot of uncertainty when you're hauled in front of a tribunal, even though you know that statistically it's extremely rare for a professor to be fired, but still there's always that lingering uncertainty. And so, yeah, I think that definitely is personal experience is part of it. If I had to think back, I still think the intellectual interest is probably what ultimately drove me there. But there's no question that the personal provided an added impetus, you might say.
I think increasingly academics, and I'm counting myself in that field, I work at the university too,
Mm.
are coming under this kind of attack, it seems. I've had one or two complaints, and I can share your feelings of apprehension when, you're first asked to explain yourself when
Right.
what you've done is really quite innocently just made a comment about your own opinion on something. Fortunately, my experience hasn't been quite as difficult as yours, and I think the second or third time, I was just simply told a letter had gone into HR, but I heard nothing more about it. So I think they're getting used to just batting some of these
Mm.
complaints away from certain groups of people. Certainly in my university.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they had this policy of just investigating everything. And so it really, in a way, offered an opportunity for people who wanted to put pressure on you could bombard the university Twitter feed, and they're very shy, gun shy about bad publicity. So something comes in even through the Twitter feed, and then that can generate a complaint. So yeah, I think it's a very flawed system as far as freedom of expression.
Is it becoming more difficult to be an academic these days? I mean, you say, I think, in your book that you resigned from your post at Birkbeck in the University of London after 2 decades of service, citing political differences. I mean, is that because it was just too difficult as an academic to be there?
Well, it's funny. There are all kinds of different pressures, and Cass Sunstein has a book called Conformity that talks about how some of these pressures can be social, some can be kind of career based. At Birkbeck, most of my colleagues, the vast majority, I was getting along fine with, and the leadership of the university is fine. The problem is, however, that a few agitators can poison the atmosphere, not so much between so that it permeates, every interaction you have, but it's just that other people know about these stories that have hit the higher education press and the various complaints. And so in the back of their mind, they know what's happened to you and that you're a little bit toxic. In your mind, you know that they know. And so it just makes all of these interactions more awkward. So if you're having to kind of socialize and go to department meetings and then attend committee meetings, it's just a bit odd. And so it's not the end of the world, but yeah, it makes it more
You don't
difficult.
fit in well. I mean, famously, Roger Scruton was at Birkbeck as well, and I think he didn't feel he fitted in terribly well because of his conservative views that he held.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's come to the book itself, and in terms of taboo and making race sacred produced a cultural revolution. Can you unpack that a little bit for us and just explain what that actually means in terms of making race sacred? What are you getting at here?
So what I'm getting at is if we think about the whole phenomenon of cancel culture and what we've just been talking about, the self-censorship regime in institutions like academia, I guess what I argue is that all of this kind of ultimately comes back to taboos, and the reason why there's such a sensitivity and why activists are able to kind of leverage that sensitivity to put pressure on academics is because there is a taboo and there is a certain degree of sacredness and enchantment around certain touchstones. And I mentioned race, gender, and sexuality. I think this really begins, the origin of this is the mid-1960s emergence of an anti-racism taboo. It's not just an anti-racism norm. I mean, there were norms around anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism and a whole bunch of other things, anti-elitism, but this is something special. It comes in very quickly and very suddenly and is commented upon by people across the political spectrum. And Paul Krugman in the New York Times, I sort of cite a piece he wrote in 2013. But Susan Sontag in 1966, again, talking about this. Shelby Steele in his book, White Guilt, he's an African-American conservative. He lived through this shift. Just this sudden change from Black people genuflecting to white people suddenly genuflecting to Black people and tiptoeing and watching what they say and do around. So that was a sudden change, a shift of cultural power. Now, and I'm saying, yeah.
Sorry, can I just ask about that? Because that's an important point. There is, I mean, everyone I think would acknowledge that there has been this huge cultural shift within the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years or so. But what is it that enables, I don't know, a group of activists or a certain group of people to make such a huge cultural change like that? How is that done? How can you shift from one set of taboos to another set of taboos? How can you just create taboos out of almost thin air and say, from now on, this is what is sacred, this is what you can't touch, this is what you're forbidden to talk about? How do you bring the change about?
Well, there's a whole literature on deviance and how things become taboos and no longer, so for example, being gay or sex before marriage, they are no longer taboos when they were. That these taboos are kind of established almost through a kind of law of the jungle process. They're asserted, and if no one pushes back on them, then people push further and create these sorts of taboos. And so, and also the way we can liken this political, I mean, there was obviously a political dimension too around this, although I think that it's interesting that this sort of anti-racism taboo is not orchestrated and designed by the left and carried through by the left. And in fact, the civil rights movement, which is really the process out of which this taboo emerges, is not really a leftist Marxist movement. I mean, which is one of the points in my book. It's actually more of a sort of bipartisan crossover movement between the kind of Republicans and the Democrats, yes, it's liberal in a way. It is about liberals, but those could be right-wing liberals, left-wing liberals, as well as the left. But the left was not the motor behind this. But then they quickly became, in some ways, the beneficiaries. So someone had a comment that, in a way, when you're in government, you get to make the laws, and when you have cultural power, you make the taboos. And so somehow we have this caesura that allows left liberalism to gain cultural power. And these taboos really give it a lot of added cultural power. But one of the points I make in the book is this is not some cultural Marxist plan. It emerges in a very sort of organic way.
This is not the
Through an
long march to the
incremental process.
institutions of Gramsci, then, is that? It's not part of that plan.
No, yeah. So I'm sort of, the sort of Chris Rufo and to some degree also Francis Fukuyama, Yasha Monk, and a whole bunch of others who talk about these not deliberate, but also these ideological developments at the elite level amongst intellectuals and then leading to some sort of war of position to try and take over institutions. I don't think that, I think some of that is going on, no question about it. But my view is this is much more of an bottom-up evolutionary kind of almost complex phenomenon that hits a tipping point, and suddenly there's this taboo that emerges. Yes, left liberalism is broadly the seedbed from which this taboo springs, and then it's the ideology that gets reinforced by the taboo. So there is a relationship there to the movement of left liberalism, which begins in the early 20th century, but it's not something that's deliberate.
But coming at it from a different angle, how much is religion? I'm talking about Orthodox religions, Christianity, Judaism, those kind of things. How much is that responsible for the creation of modern taboos in this sense that, I mean, taboos normally come from religious backgrounds, don't they? So, no sex before marriage, you've mentioned, no adultery, no stealing. All of that is part of the taboos of the Ten Commandments and Christian tradition and those kind of things. And yet those have been replaced. They are the ones which have now pretty well been pushed to one side and been replaced by a different set of taboos. So my question is, how much is religion responsible for allowing its own grip on social taboos to just be pushed to one side? Or maybe they haven't presented them as strongly as they did in the past. And so that a vacuum has been created. I'm just voicing ideas.
Yes. I mean, this is an argument too, that this idea of a woke as a kind of substitute religion is an argument that's been made by quite a few writers, and Joshua Mitchell is one, and even, Andrew Doyle and to some degree, John McWhorter and others. I'm not as convinced by that argument. I mean, what you can see is that if you take, say, Protestantism, American Protestantism, but also British Anglicanism, for example, there's been a very easy melding between the sort of what I would call cultural socialism, this idea of equal outcomes for men and women, or white and black, as anything less than perfect equality is an outrage. That kind of ideology has permeated quite easily into certainly the upper layers of the what you might call the mainline Protestant churches in the US and also in Britain. And so, in my view, is actually there is quite a bit of compatibility between woke ideology and at least certain versions of Christianity. There isn't the same antagonism there would be with something like patriotism, which is much more antagonistic to woke. With certain versions of particularly the humanistic types of religion, ecumenical movement, liberal Protestantism, it's actually a fairly strong fit. And you could make the argument that some of these ideas in a roundabout way come out of that humanistic, liberal, ecumenical Protestantism of the early 20th century. And so I think it's a complicated relationship. The other thing is that strongly religious people who identify as on the left are no less likely to essentially sign up to tenets of wokeness, such as, America's a racist country, or having white guilt, or these sorts of things. They're no less likely than people who are non-religious, but who also identify on the left. So I think it's more, now, it is true that if you're Christian, you're less likely to identify as a liberal and a Democrat. And so to that extent, then Christianity is in some ways a bulwark against this, but it's not as much of a bulwark as, for example, competing secular ideas like nationalism, for example.
Right. What has driven the huge acceptance of woke amongst the establishment? I mean, we have Pride Month here in June. It's probably the same in the States. I think it may be the same month or maybe a different month. But you can't go out onto the streets in London without seeing massive amounts of flags everywhere. The main companies, Sainsbury's or Tesco's, they're all flying these kind of woke symbols. And even when you come out of Charing Cross Station, across the road there is one of the headquarters of Coutts Bank. Coutts is probably the most establishment figure in the country, plastered over with this kind of symbolism. It's been a massive takeover of all the establishment areas, and it's done so in an almost complete way.
Yeah.
How does that come about that everyone ties into it? Everyone buys into this thing.
Yeah, and I sort of see this as something similar to this sort of idea of the sacred canopy in a religious society where, people in Italy are Catholic, and so you'll have a Madonna in a public space and a cross in a courtroom, and so it's this kind of public religion that we're seeing. Where did it come from? Well, first of all, one of my arguments in the book is this is not new. Actually, what we're seeing is an acceleration rather than a deviation from what went before. So I would trace a line between, for example, humanistic cosmopolitanism of the early 20th century, multiculturalism, which emerges in the US in the 1910s in a way, going forward into, now, of course, multiculturalism starts to be talked about more explicitly in the 70s and 80s. And then the kind of critical race type approach, critical gender approach that we're seeing today. That I think is just simply a question of scale, not really of ideas. It's been roughly the same sets of sacred touchstones: race, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender, since the late 60s. And so I kind of talk about three awakenings, because this is a sort of, I envision this as a sort of bottom-up, leaderless, kind of ecstatic type of movement. You tend to get these waves, as you do in American Protestantism, these awakenings. So emotional enthusiasms, mass mobilizations. Late 1960s, you had the student occupations, you had, Black Panthers occupying buildings. The rise of Black Studies was an activist project. It was achieved by force and moral pressure and essentially emotional blackmail in a way. And then you get, and in fact, there were restrictions on free speech of, military recruiters. Certain professors had their, talks interrupted, which ironically, some of the critical theorists like Adorno complained about and called this left-wing fascism. So that was wave one in the 60s. Now, this was very confined to the campus in a way. Wave two is late 80s, early 90s, with multiculturalism, affirmative action becoming more prominent, speech codes, political correctness, Eurocentric, all of this sort of discourse. And I think what we're talking about now is really a continuation and acceleration of that, spreading off campus because of social media, connecting journalists to academics. But it's really the same ideology. And so that's one of the points of my book, is that this thing is not new. Now, it has spread. It might at one time have been very concentrated in the Berkeleys of this world, and maybe in Canada, the Toronto District School Board, in Britain, maybe Hackney Council or Greater London Council. It's now everywhere. So it's a scaling up, and it's just that some people, if you are a scientist, you wouldn't have seen this in the first two awakenings. But in the third awakening, suddenly you're getting DEI requirements and mandatory diversity statements and decolonizing mathematics coming at you, and you think this is new. But if you'd been in gender studies circles, then you wouldn't have seen much change over time.
Yeah. We've had an election here in the UK, and I know there's an election coming up in America, and it seems that there's a fairly clear division, if I've understood it rightly, between in America the Republicans and the Democrats, where Democrats are very much lined up in favor of woke things, but Trump, on the other hand, is very, very anti-woke in that respect. And in this country, in the UK, we've got the Labour Party, which is very much a bit like the Democrats, and the Conservative Party, which is a bit like the Republicans. Do you see, particularly, say, in the UK, having just had the Labour Party win by a landslide, is this going to affect society along these lines as well?
Yes, I think well, I think it will. Now, it's worth saying that I argue that essentially, because this is bottom up and emergent, it's activists pressuring institutions. It's not primarily coming from the state, although the state can sometimes be an engine of this. We see this in Canada, where I'm from, where Justin Trudeau's Liberals have been pushing this very hard. But very often what's happened, and certainly in Britain, is you get an infiltration of public bodies, of schools and universities. So the institutional layer is targeted by activists. The Tories sporadically try to place some limits and push back here and there, but not particularly effectively. They did it to some degree. They got Stonewall out of certain parts of the civil service. They issued some guidance around indoctrination in schools. They had the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which I was involved with. So there are certain things that they did. And certainly the signals that people like Kemi Badenoch talking about critical race theory, Oliver Dowden about retain and explain. And so there were signals that at least suggested to activists and institutions that you better hide what you're doing, because this is not popular with the higher ups. Now, that exerted some restraint, not a great deal of restraint. Now, I think what we've got, when you've got, Annalise Dodds coming in, and you have, Bridget Phillipson and people who are really quite openly woke. It's a simply different set of signals that are being sent to the education establishment, that is being sent to the civil service, and so I think those restraints are off. That to me is the biggest effect. Now, there's going to be some legislation around race, which again will supercharge, I think, these processes. But the main reason I think we're going to see more woke in public life in Britain is because the activists will be much more emboldened. There won't be any of the restraints, even subtle restraints, that were there under the conservatives. As ineffective as the conservatives were in rolling this back, they at least provided some resistance.
Hmm. Is this the diametric opposite to what's happening in the States? I mean, it looks at the present time with Biden versus Trump. The Trump is very much, well, more probable to get the presidency in November than Biden is, from the way things are looking at the moment. But there's an almost visceral hatred against Trump by certain quarters in the States. And I wonder, is that visceral hatred against Trump based upon his ideas that he can't stand woke things and would dismantle woke structures? Is that where that hatred comes from, or is it not based upon woke? Is it something else?
I think it's not. Okay, so I think the main visceral hatred, particularly of the sort of left liberal elite in the US, primarily comes not from Trump's threat to democracy in January 6th and talking about the election being stolen and these violations of democratic. I mean, that is sort of the respectable reason, kind of, and it's a reason that's a bit more bipartisan. Many people can understand that, but it's mainly about him violating the taboos which have developed since the late 60s around race in particular. So when you sort of insinuate that, you know, a low standard of population is coming across from Mexico, for example, or you talk about shithole countries, or I mean, he's quite clearly walking all over the sort of sacred lines. And in some ways, I think the criticism is well placed of Trump on these issues, but in other cases, it's not. So, for example, building a wall on the southern border, most Democratic voters would say that's racist. Actually, it's got nothing to do with racism. It is a perfectly legitimate measure for a state to secure its border. Now, it's different when you talk about Mexicans as being rapists. Yes, there I think the charge is accurate. But essentially, I think it's his willingness to violate these taboos that really underlies the hatred, particularly from that left liberal intellectual elite. And I think going forward, now his attacks on woke, again, are going to engender a lot of sort of pushback. I think it is worth saying, however, that, and in my book, I've got a lot of survey data. And so if you look at the public opinion, there's a big divide between older leftists or liberals and younger leftists and liberals. The older leftists and liberals have some vestigial attachment to ideas around freedom of expression, for example, pursuit of objective truth. Younger leftists and liberals are much more likely to be illiberal progressives. And so I think they're the ones who are going to be especially outraged by Trump. And yeah, make no mistake, I think that really the US is kind of at the leading edge of the kind of anti-woke policy space. So targeting DEI, defunding it, banning critical race theory in schools, the gender, no biological males in women's sports, women's spaces, all of that legislative activity in the red states, I think will be something that Trump will then implement at the federal level. And this is going to be pretty revolutionary, and it's way ahead of anything that's been done in any other country. So in Britain, it's very piecemeal, but there I think it's going to be a lot more effective and organized this time around. Although having said that, Trump has a remarkable ability to be ineffective. So he's now sort of targeting Project 2025, which is sort of an organized effort to try and get Republican-leaning appointees into the federal bureaucracy. I think Trump is very focused on Trump, and so his worry is this is somehow going to upstage him. So if that very egotistical Trump really comes to the fore and gets in the way of these efforts to essentially push back in the bureaucracy, then maybe we'll just see a bunch of chaos and very little happening.
Yeah, you do go into in the book. I mean, coming back to this, one of the things which strikes me is that it's very heavily evidenced. There's a lot of data in here, many charts and graphs, which just prove your point. But I think one of the values of the book that many people will look to as being probably one of the important parts, or the more important part of the book maybe, would be you have a kind of a 12-point plan towards the end here of counteracting woke. And I wanted to look at some of those because some of them I found fairly straightforward, but some of them I found quite surprising in terms of that. We won't look at all of them, but I mean, the first of your 12-point plan to counter to woke was to do with free speech, which I think probably we can all easily agree on, that this is something which is under attack here. And particularly you point out in the book that younger people seem to have less respect or less desire for free speech, and more of a desire in some cases for authoritarian controls and dictators than they do for free speech, which is really surprising that they've come along that way. But how do you establish free speech in that kind of an environment?
Well, yeah, I think that in public, I think one way of doing this is to use government power. So one of the arguments I make is we have to see society as being three levels, not two. The sort of Madisonian, starting in the late 18th century, liberalism seemed to be very oriented against the state and the abuse of state power, and it's all about limited government. But actually, if you go back to Locke and Hobbes, they recognize that private violence and private censorship can be threats to liberty. And there, I think we're back into a situation where I see this as the state, in the institutions in the middle, and then citizenry. A lot of the oppression, suppression of speech is coming from those institutions. And government is much more scrutinized and more elected. It's the democracy, it's open to scrutiny, and it's the one institution, the majority of the population, and the 2/3 of the population is opposed to woke, 1/3 is supportive on average. So that 2/3 can control elected government. They need to use elected government to actually control the institutions. So I'm very much in favor of using government to prevent, say, universities from firing people for speech or censoring staff and students. Similarly, now it depends. Obviously, if you're talking about the espionage agencies, they don't have free speech. And teachers don't have the same level of free speech that professors have. There are different levels, but still, to the greatest extent possible, what citizens do in their private life should be protected and should not be grounds for employers firing individuals.
But the question is naturally raised then is, what do you do when the government itself suppresses free speech? And I'm not just talking about closed totalitarian societies. I mean, it's been recently, the government in America has been shown to have exercised some, shall we say, some influence over social media companies, suppressing certain things on either Facebook or Twitter before Elon Musk took over it, in order to close down certain avenues of conversation. And to seek to try to entrust the government with being the policeman here may not work, or...
Yeah, I mean, we obviously also have, courts with constitutional documents and rights documents to act as a check on government overreach. But what I would say is that if a government decides to pursue an online harms bill, blasphemy laws through the back door, and other kinds of illiberal measures, yes, the courts, I think, are going to be one line of defense. But of course, government has a lot of power to set guidance, and to establish the bounds of free speech. I think in a democracy, you may go through a period where a government is pushing those boundaries, pushing those limits in the direction of illiberalism. The population at least has the power to vote them out and to shift things back the other way. So at least there's a check. And the courts are a check as well.
Yeah, there are a number of countries putting forward hate speech laws. There's one going through Ireland at the moment, which might be enacted, which is many of these are seeking to clamp down on free speech on the grounds that it might hurt or injure other people. There's this tension.
Yeah,
And
and Canada's the same. They've got a terrible law going in on that. Yeah, I think this misinformation and hate speech are the sort of code words, are used to justify limits on speech, increasingly by the left. And to the extent we can use the courts to push back on that, that's important. But also, in addition, you need, electoral competition, to expose this sort of creeping attack on our freedoms, to try and raise the consciousness of the population that their expressive freedom is being eroded, and they need to defend that robustly. So I do think democracy can also be a check on that. But I still say, in the book, that a lot of the everyday restrictions on our liberties are coming from institutions.
yeah,
And yeah.
I mean, I was going to say that brings you to the second of your suggested solutions here was to make public bodies politically neutral. I think the BBC and the Australian Broadcasting Company, Canadian Broadcasting Company. How do you actually do that, particularly when they're introducing their own ideas of standards of truth, which are not always the same standards of truth that normal people might have, their disinformation units, those kind of things. How do you try to bring back some neutrality to those organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this gets down to the political will, the willingness to expend political capital on cultural issues. And so if you had a determined government, they could drive through, first of all, write detailed guidance on what is political. So, you could call DEI and critical race and gender theory political, which right now, teachers are pretending, or at least the radical teachers are pretending, that teaching critical race theory is not political. That is because the guidance is not tight enough and the enforcement is not tight enough. So I think a committed government could demand accountability, write very detailed guidance, mainstream this in the inspection regime, ask the inspectors to come in and account for themselves in Parliament, do a much more exhaustive kind of inventory of exactly what's going on in schools, what's going on in the civil service. And what we've seen is, in fact, the educational establishment, the civil service, has been able to sort of outdistance the elected government. The elected government has not been focused enough. Now, in the US, you can see there are certain states like Florida. Ron DeSantis has been very focused. Glenn Youngkin in Virginia has been very focused on schools and getting critical race and gender ideology out of schools, and has been, I would argue, in both cases, I think they've been quite effective. So where you have an executive that makes this a priority, that mobilizes its voters around these issues, they can expend the capital and make it very clear they're not going to put up with attempts to circumvent the law, which, of course, activists are going to try and do. They're going to try and circumvent the law, but if some of them lose their jobs and that becomes widely known, then you're going to get a chilling effect. So I think political neutrality, and similar in the civil service, you could say Stonewall has to be out of the civil service, and similar political kite marking organizations you should not have them in the civil service. Just as in schools, you can say all third-party providers either have to be vetted or have to have all their materials transparent and open to inspection. That's what I mean, is if you had a government that was very determined, I think they could ensure political neutrality in these institutions.
Okay. One of the other suggestions which you have, of the 12 suggestions, which surprised me, was that you would open public bodies to political appointments, rather like, I suppose, the US Supreme Court. I've always thought of the US Supreme Court as one of the weak areas of the American Constitution because it's politically appointed. The 7 judges always seem to split according to party lines, and yet you see this as a solution. How does that work?
The reason I say that, it's not ideal, but it is the least worst option. Why? Well, because if you don't do that, the judiciary will just drift to the left, like a lot of institutions, because that is really the supply of graduates is increasingly left-wing, and even more so now than it was in the past. And that is a threat, I think, to democracy. I mean, and we're seeing this in places like Canada. The Supreme Court, the court system is now heavily compromised by progressive ideology to the point where the Supreme Court will tweet out messages, in support of, for example, affirmative action quotas. In this case, for men and women, but and we're seeing the courts very much deferring to Trudeau, his agenda, to the agenda of various public bodies that want to discriminate politically. So I think there you see the dangers of allowing the court system to go, the conservative government asleep at the switch, the previous conservative government in Canada not getting involved enough in political appointments. It is inevitably political. The judges are inevitably political. Now, the goal should be at some point in the future to get past this and to return in a more consensual, high trust society to something that is nonpartisan, and that we don't actually have to be as vigilant about who we're appointing. But in the absence of that, in a situation where the woke left is attempting to infiltrate public bodies from below, I think there is no other option but for the conservative side, which is only really going to have power over elected government. That's the only institution that they can hope to control. They have to use that to get their people into judicial appointments, but also into the bureaucracy. And so this Project 2025 would be an example of that. It's not great because ultimately that leads to a sort of, not a paralysis, but kind of zigzagging where each side comes in, gets rid of the people that were there before and puts their people in. It's not perfect. And in a way, it kind of reflects a society that's a bit like the consociational societies in the Netherlands and Northern Ireland, where there's trust is broken down. The only sort of modus vivendi is to go on a proportional basis, each side getting its share of, whether it be Protestant or Catholic or Republican or Democrat, because there is no overarching trust. And I actually blame the left for eroding a lot of this, that they have come in and deliberately sought to acquire power by infiltrating these institutions. And I think that in so doing, they have undermined the neutrality and the authority of these institutions and politicized them. And I think there is really no option but for the other side to do the same, just to prevent these institutions from essentially becoming arms of the other side politically.
Right. We're coming to the end of
Yeah.
our time here,
Sure.
and there's one last question though I did want to ask you, and that is that again, another surprising thing I found in your book was towards the end, you say that if you think that woke is just going to disappear by itself, eventually wear itself out, then think again, because you think that's not going to happen. It's not like McCarthyism that just burnt itself out or came to a point where it couldn't continue anymore. You believe that woke will continue and maybe even get stronger. Is that why? Can you say a little bit more of why that kind of pessimistic view is a feature of the book here?
Well, I mean, I think just in terms of the most proximal reason is because the young population is a lot more woke than the old population. So just in terms of cohort replacement dynamics, generational turnover will push value change in the direction of, what we might call progressive illiberalism. And in fact, if you look at studies of value change using the World Value Survey, they show that most value change has been cohort led. And we can, if you think about the decline of religion, the rise of more tolerant attitudes towards homosexuality or race, or, and many of these are good things I support, but they've come about through generational turnover. And likewise, I think generational turnover is going to push us in this direction of prioritizing crudely equality over liberty in the cultural sphere.
Okay, so finally then,
Yeah.
Look forward to the future for us. What is the West, maybe the UK, more than the States, I don't know, going to look like in, say, 50 years' time? We've got changing demographics. That's going to affect things.
Right.
What will the country look like in the 50 years as if things continue the way they are?
Well, okay, I think you're going to have a much greater degree of polarization around these issues, the woke, the culture wars issues, the boundaries of speech, the debates over history, for example, and identity will become stronger. You can already see right now, just look at the recent election in France. Young people, there's a significant populist right support base amongst young people in France, and there is a very significant radical left support base. The radical left is bigger than the populist right. Britain, too, by the way, the young people who are on the right are more reformy than Tory. And if you actually look at various other data sets, the young people, there's a greater polarization on these issues. Now, there is, of course, a swath in the middle which doesn't care that much. And you could make the argument that if the society is overwhelming in its view of an issue, then that central group that doesn't care very much could be pushed into a free speech camp in the future. So it's not completely lost. It's just that the center of gravity of this emerging generation is towards the woke side. So I'm somewhat pessimistic. Now, we've also got the ethnic diversity, which in some ways, to some degree, cuts against this kind of ideological polarization, and to some degree, it reinforces it. And it's not clear exactly. So you can see, for example, on LGBT, that the growing ethnic religious diversity cuts against that. Muslims protesting against LGBT teaching in schools, etc. We saw in Detroit, that there are certain local governments that have banned pride parades. Those are now where Muslims have a significant voice. But in other cases, perhaps on the race question, race issues, some minority groups are less pro-free speech. In fact, many of them are less pro-free speech than whites in America. And so that portends more speech restrictions, potentially. So I do think that the idea of free speech and classical liberalism will face stronger headwinds going forward. But I also think those will be the basis of cultural cleavages and that will start to decide elections. Increasingly, my argument in the book is that the culture wars is going to play in elections. It's already started to play in elections. Yeah, and I think we're going to see more of that going forward as these become big divides in politics.
Is the world going to be a better place to live in 50 years' time, or a worse place?
I think it's going to be a more fractious place with lower trust. But I don't go the distance and say we're going to have civil war, because I think you have cross-cutting cleavages. So already, say, if you look at the United States, the partisan cleavage, left to right, liberal or Republican Democrat, has become increasingly intense. But the race cleavage has actually depolarized. So now you have almost as high Hispanic support for Trump as white support for Trump. And in a way, the sort of fact that a lot of minorities are not woke means that as they increase, we've now got these cross-cutting. The ideological woke, anti-woke cleavage is to some degree bisected by the white, non-white cleavage. So whereas if all whites were anti-woke and all minorities were woke, we would have a huge problem. So in that sense, I'm not super pessimistic that we're going to descend into violence, but I do think we're going to have a low trust, fractionalized politics where cultural issues are more dominant in deciding elections, and that makes policy harder.
Eric Kaufmann, thank you ever so much for a very interesting, fascinating conversation. And the book is called Taboo: How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. It's got some very excellent endorsements on the back by Rupert Toombs and Neil Ferguson and Frank Furedi as well. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Philip. I enjoyed it very much.